Let's now focus on Town Hall. What a building! A building that really embodies the spirit of that late Victorian period through its architecture and what it represented. The centerpiece of this growing metropolis, and still a very important and beautiful building which functions as Sydney's Town Hall even today. Town Hall itself was built between the 1860s and 1880s, which was leading up to a big year for the colonial city, which is 1888. So that's 100 years after the original convicts, colonists, soldiers, settlers arrived on 11 ships, the first fleet in 1788. So much had changed in that 1 century. Forests had turned into busy streets. Rocky caves around the harbour had been quarried for their sandstone to create these grand structures. Shallow shorelines had become rimmed with wooden wharf fronts, and ship after ship would be coming to port, and with them came many thousands of new immigrants. For Sydney's ancient indigenous inhabitants, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, these changes would be very hard felt. The landscape had transformed around them, and the ever-increasing colonial infrastructure and colonial culture had largely displaced their own ancient way of life. Sydney was of course aware of this, and when the Grand Town Hall clock tower was erected, and have a look at it now, you can see that on either side of this central shield are 2 figures. On the left, an Aboriginal man. He's holding a fishing spear and a boomerang, and really representing Sydney's ancient indigenous past. On the right-hand side of the shield is a colonial man, and he looks like a sailor or explorer holding a flag. Underneath these 2 figures is a little ribbon that has a piece of writing on it, quite hard to see, but this is what they inscribed into the sandstone. "I take, but I surrender." This phrase would be chosen as a motto of sorts for the Crest of Sydney. It's been interpreted as referring to taking possession of the land from the ancient indigenous inhabitants of Sydney and Australia, but then surrendering that land by giving it back to the people in the form of a city. Being quite ambiguous in its meaning and perhaps a little out of date, it is certainly no longer used by the Town Hall or the Sydney coat of arms in the 21st century. But aside from this 19th century motto that was inscribed into the sandstone, there are plenty more symbols that are etched into, for instance, the shield that is between the 2 figures. On the shield, at the top, you will see what is in fact a beehive, and the beehive represents the buzzing of industry. Sydney really thought that it was starting to make its own honey, if you will, in the sense that industrial manufacturing, trade, architecture, the commercial sector all seemed to be picking up pace. So the best they could do to represent that was a busy beehive. Below the beehive, of course, is an old-fashioned sailing ship. And Sydney still really saw itself as a port town. People arrive by sea. Its maritime history, whether that be explorations that of Captain Cook or the arrival of convicts on transport ships, really was part of Sydney's identity. But while ships often implied journeys, you'll also see above the shield an upside-down anchor going through a crown, and that, of course, referring to this idea that out of all that transit, ships sailing, Sydney's maritime history, this city has been anchored into the place we are, and Town Hall was the centre of it. Funnily enough, Town Hall hadn't been the centre of Sydney for long. The land on which the building sits had begun as a graveyard. Burials started to take place here from the late 18th century and into the early 1800s. It's a reminder that once upon a time, this area was really the outskirts of Sydney. The village was in the rocks. It was known as the Old Sydney Burial Ground and was the resting place of about 2,000 people, many of them dating back to early convict and colonial times that had been buried here. And while the graveyard closed in 1820, headstones, coffins, and the general sense of it being a cemetery continued over the next few decades even though town had well and truly encroached upon it, and a fresh produce market had been installed right next door. But between the 1840s and the 1860s, the graveyard was in such bad condition that it seems many of the headstones had been taken from the burial ground and were used as pavement stones in the streets nearby. Thus, it wasn't long before the land was reclaimed and the construction of Town Hall would commence. However, of course, they needed to move all of those dead bodies, which were dug up and taken largely to another cemetery known as the Sandhills. But these poor pioneers of early Sydney wouldn't get much time to rest in peace there either, because that land was reclaimed to be Central Station by the beginning of the 20th century. But back at Town Hall, the foundation stone was laid by none other than Prince Alfred, the second son of Queen Victoria, on a royal trip to Sydney in 1868. The finished piece by the end of the 1880s included an enormous ballroom, which still has lots of functions and events inside. And still to this day, its regal-looking staircase is still a very popular meeting place for people in Sydney. And whilst the city has changed rapidly around it and modernised in many ways, it sits between two other iconic sandstone structures from this period, St Andrew's Cathedral and the Queen Victoria Building, which is known in Sydney as the QVB. That'll be our next spot. But if you have the chance, take a little wander around Town Hall and St Andrew's Cathedral. All of the outside areas have lots of ornate sculptures to interpret, and perhaps you're there at the strike of the hour when the clock bell chimes.